People say never mix personal hobbies with professional work, but when my boss fired me in front of the entire department for my cheap and pathetic hobby, I did not just pack my desk. I patented the very formula he mocked, monopolized his core supply chain, and calmly watched 20 years of his career collapse over a single phone call. Buckle up. This is not an impulsive reaction. This is a calculated, ruthless, and highly satisfying corporate purge. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Boss Revenge Stories. Unfortunately, YouTube has completely disabled our channel's monetization feature, leaving us with absolutely zero budget to continue our operations. If you find today's story satisfying, please consider supporting us by joining our Patreon community, where you can listen to exclusive, true, and even better revenge stories that are significantly longer. Over there, we describe detailed situations that we simply cannot make public on YouTube, and we use multiple emotional voice actors within a single story to bring the drama to life. You can join us by scanning the QR code right on your screen, or you can click the Patreon link provided in the description or the pinned comment of this video. Now, let us dive straight into today's story, and my name is Emery Bishop. The fluorescent lights in the main laboratory of Vertex Biosolutions had a distinct, high-pitched hum that clawed at my sanity after the 10th hour. I was a 32-year-old material chemist at this massive chemical corporation based in Chicago, and I was currently drowning in the middle of a brutal 14-hour shift. My physical body was completely running on empty, sustained only by the bitter sludge of cold, day-old coffee, and a box of desperately dry crackers I kept hidden in my bottom drawer. My vision blurred as I stared at the chaotic molecular structures on my monitor, trying to salvage a severely failing emulsifier project that my entire department was relying on. My shoulders ached. My eyes burned from the harsh chemical fumes permeating the ventilation system, and the sheer exhaustion felt like a lead weight pressing down on my chest. Then, the air in the room suddenly shifted. Before I even heard his footsteps, my nose was assaulted by the overpowering, nauseating stench of synthetic musk and cheap arrogance. It was Trent, as the vice president of product development. Trent was a man who wore his undeserved authority like a crown. He had built a 20-year career out of aggressively stealing credit from his subordinates, smiling for the board of directors while stepping on the necks of the people actually doing the labor. He leaned over my desk, invading my personal space, and tapped his manicured finger against my screen. He demanded updates we both knew were impossible within his artificial deadlines. When I calmly tried to present a slight modification to the chemical binding process that would save us days of wasted testing, his face immediately tightened with patronizing annoyance. He sneered, looking down his nose at me, and said loudly enough for the neighboring cubicles to hear, "Emery, women should just follow the established procedures. Stop trying to be creative and just do the job you are paid to do." My jaw clenched so hard my teeth ached, but I swallowed the sharp retort burning in my throat. In this corporate machine, arguing with a man like Trent was career suicide. My real life, the only thing keeping my spirit from entirely breaking under Trent's tyranny, began on the weekends. My sanctuary was the detached garage behind my house, while my colleagues spent their free time drinking away their corporate misery. I found my escape in a bizarre, messy little hobby. I had transformed my cramped garage into a makeshift extraction laboratory. I was quietly experimenting with extracting heavy-duty industrial bioadhesives entirely from biological agricultural waste. It was a completely eco-friendly alternative to the toxic sludge Vertex produced. It was just a personal passion project, a way to remind myself why I fell in love with chemistry in the first place, away from the suffocating corporate bureaucracy. After months of failed attempts and sticky disasters, I finally synthesized a batch of amber liquid that felt different. The consistency was flawless, gripping anything it touched with terrifying immediate strength. But I needed absolute proof of its molecular stability. I needed proper corporate-grade equipment. Vertex had a massive, multi-million-dollar mass spectrometer sitting idly in the darkest, dustiest corner of the secondary analytical lab. No one had touched the machine in months because the department lacked the funding to run the specific projects assigned to it. So, during my strictly mandated 30-minute lunch break the following Tuesday, I slipped into the empty room with a tiny, unmarked glass vial of my homemade bioadhesive. My heart hammered wildly against my ribs as I booted up the sleeping giant, praying no senior managers would walk through the door. When the analysis finally printed out, I stood frozen in the cold laboratory, my eyes scanning the data over and over again to ensure I was not hallucinating from sleep deprivation. The results were not just good, they were absolutely staggering. The molecular lattice of my garage creation possessed a tensile strength exactly 3 times higher than the premium standard adhesive currently bringing in millions for Vertex. Even more unbelievably, because I was utilizing discarded agricultural waste. The manufacturing cost was exactly 1/10 of what my company was spending on their toxic synthetic alternatives. I was holding a total industry revolution inside a completely unremarkable, cheap glass vial. I knew I could never show this to Trent. He would simply steal the formula, slap his own name on the patent, and fire me for insubordination. Instead, I carefully folded the printout and slipped it into my pocket. That evening, sitting at my kitchen table, I compiled a secure dossier and sent it to a man named Marcus. Marcus was an independent materials distribution manager operating on the East Coast. He had followed my academic scientific papers years ago before I sold my soul to Vertex, and I knew from industry whispers that he was desperately hunting for a groundbreaking green product line to secure a massive government contract. I hit send, watching the progress bar complete, unaware that this single click was the spark that would eventually burn Trent's entire kingdom to the ground. Friday morning began with a deceptive calm, the kind of heavy, suffocating quiet that precedes a catastrophic storm. At exactly 9 o'clock, a high priority, mandatory calendar invitation flashed simultaneously across the monitors of all 40 members of the research and development team. The location designated was the primary glass-walled conference chamber. This was a massive, intimidating space located at the very center of the floor, usually reserved strictly for executive board meetings, high-stakes client negotiations, and quarterly financial bloodbaths. We filed into the room, a herd of exhausted scientists clutching our morning beverages and digital tablets. A collective, unspoken sense of dread hung heavy in the artificially chilled air. Trent was already present, standing perfectly still at the head of the incredibly long mahogany table. He did not look angry. He looked predatory. He looked absolutely triumphant, his chest puffed out beneath his expensive tailored suit. As the last person crossed the threshold and pulled the heavy glass door shut, sealing us inside the transparent, soundproof box, Trent raised a thick manila folder high in the air. He held it there for a dramatic second before slamming it down onto the polished wood with a violent crack that echoed like a gunshot in the confined space. The room's automated blackout blinds smoothly descended, casting all 40 of us into dim, anxious shadows. Then, the giant overhead projector flared to life with a mechanical hum. My stomach instantly plummeted into an icy, bottomless abyss. Projected onto the wall, magnified 100 times its actual size, was a high-resolution, full-color photograph of the tiny, unmarked glass vial I had hidden. Beside the photograph was a detailed, heavily tracked digital system log. My specific employee identification number was highlighted in a glaring neon yellow block, stamped right next to the access registry for the Secondary Analytical Laboratory's mass spectrometer. The digital timestamp glared down at me. He had gone through my workstation. He had aggressively rummaged through my locked personal drawer while I was out on the production floor running standard tests the previous afternoon. Trent leaned forward, pressing his knuckles into the table, his eyes locking onto mine with a sickening, unblinking gleam of absolute victory. The silence in the room was completely suffocating. The only sound was the low hum of the ventilation system. He let the agonizing tension stretch, clearly savoring the absolute power he held in that moment, before he finally opened his mouth. "This corporation does not pay you a 6-figure salary," Trent began, his voice dripping with a venomous, theatrical sarcasm that amplified through the room's high-end acoustics. So that you can use our million-dollar equipment to service your pathetic, amateur hobby of cooking up cheap soap or homemade hand lotion. The heat of pure, unadulterated humiliation rushed up my neck, burning my cheeks and making my ears ring. Every single pair of eyes in that room immediately pivoted towards my chair. I gripped the edge of the heavy table with both hands to stop my fingers from trembling, forcing myself to maintain direct eye contact with the man who was actively trying to destroy me. "That is not soap," I stated, forcing my voice to remain remarkably steady despite the hurricane of panic tearing through my chest. "It is a highly viable, experimental biological polymer research initiative, a potential industrial adhesive alternative. I did not utilize a single cent of corporate financial resources to create it, and I only operated the scanning machinery during my strictly unpaid break period." "Shut your mouth," Trent snapped, his polite, corporate facade vanishing in a fraction of a second, replaced by raw, unfiltered malice. He slammed his open hand onto the table again, making the coffee mugs rattle. "You do not get to dictate what is viable in my department. You are stealing corporate time. You are misusing restricted, highly sensitive analytical equipment. Most importantly, you have fundamentally violated the core trust of this institution. You are a massive liability. Emery, a desperate, delusional liability who thinks she is smarter than the established protocols." I frantically looked around the vast room, silently begging for someone, anyone, to interject. There were senior chemists sitting mere feet away who had mentored me for years, project leads I had covered countless weekend shifts for, and peers who knew perfectly well that the spectrometer in question was practically an abandoned relic gathering dust. But the silence that met my pleading gaze was deafening. All 40 of my colleagues suddenly found the blank pages of their notebooks or the black screens of their tablets utterly fascinating. They bowed their heads, their shoulders hunched defensively, terrified that making eye contact with me would somehow mark them as accomplices to my alleged crimes. They were protecting their own mortgages and paychecks, entirely willing to sit in silence and watch me hang so they would not become Trent's next target. Before I could formulate another logical defense, the glass door clicked open heavily behind me. 2 large, broad-shouldered, uniformed security guards stepped aggressively into the conference room. Trent pushed a single, densely typed sheet of paper across the long table toward my seat. It was an immediate, non-negotiable termination agreement. "Sign it," he commanded, his voice returning to a smug, professional, and entirely deadpan monotone. "Or the legal department will press immediate criminal charges for corporate espionage and intentional property theft." The pen felt like a 100-pound piece of lead in my trembling fingers. I could not read the legal jargon blurring on the bright white page. All I saw was the sudden, violent death of my entire career. I signed my name with a jerky, unfamiliar scrawl. The guards immediately stepped closer, looming right over my shoulders. I was not allowed to return to my desk to collect my photographs. I was not allowed to say a single word of goodbye to the people I had worked alongside for years. One of the imposing guards handed me a pathetic, small cardboard box containing my winter coat, my unwashed coffee mug, and my purse. They had already packed my life into a 12-inch square. I was physically escorted down the long, sterile, fluorescent-lit hallway, marched through the crowded main lobby, and pushed out into the freezing Chicago wind in exactly 15 minutes. As the heavy automated glass doors locked firmly behind me, the sheer gravity of the situation hit me with the force of a physical blow. I had just lost my livelihood, my massive portfolio of unvested stock options representing years of blood and sweat, and every single ounce of my professional dignity. The first 72 hours of my unexpected unemployment were a pathetic blur of absolute, unadulterated misery. I became a permanent fixture on my sagging living room sofa, cocooned beneath a heavy fleece blanket like a depressed caterpillar entirely refusing to join the real world. The sudden, deafening silence of my apartment was agonizing compared to the constant, high-pitched mechanical hum of the laboratory I was so accustomed to. My daily diet consisted solely of cold, congealed pepperoni pizza and lukewarm tap water. Every few hours, I would torture myself by opening my mobile banking application, staring blankly at the digital numbers on the glowing screen. After mathematically factoring in the absolute necessity of paying my rent for the upcoming month, my total liquid assets amounted to roughly what a middle school teenager makes delivering newspapers over a summer. I was a highly educated, 32-year-old scientist whose entire professional net worth had just evaporated into thin air, leaving me practically destitute in the middle of a brutal, unforgiving metropolitan winter. On the fourth morning, while I was mindlessly scrolling through an endless, soul-crushing barrage of entry-level quality assurance job postings that paid absolutely nothing, my cell phone suddenly and violently vibrated against the wooden coffee table. The caller identification displayed Marcus. I blindly swiped the screen to answer, fully expecting a polite message of condolence regarding my very public professional execution. Instead, Marcus was practically yelling into the receiver, his voice tight with an electric, breathless excitement that forced me to sit up straight. "Emery, are you sitting down?" he demanded, not even bothering to say hello. "I sent your agricultural bioadhesive dossier to the chief procurement officer of a massive European chemical conglomerate. They ran independent stress tests on the sample. They are absolutely losing their minds over it. The molecular stability held up under extreme thermal shock. They want to ink an exclusive distribution contract right this second. They are ready to wire a ridiculous amount of money just to secure the total patent rights." Any normal, terrified, newly unemployed person would have jumped at the chance to sell the intellectual property for a quick, massive lump sum of cash. It would have solved all my immediate financial problems in a single stroke. But the ghost of Trent laughing in that glass room flashed vividly behind my eyes. The burning, toxic memory of his public humiliation ignited a completely different kind of fire deep in my gut. Selling out was the easy way. It was the safe, cowardly corporate way. I did not want a quick payout. I wanted absolute destruction. "No," I said, my voice eerily calm, surprising even myself. "I am not selling the patent to them. Marcus, I am going to manufacture it myself. I will be the sole direct supplier. If they want the product, they buy it directly from my factory, and I need you to handle the supply chain logistics." There was a long, heavy pause on the line before Marcus let out a low, deeply appreciative whistle. "You are completely insane. I love it. Let us get to work." Within exactly 48 hours, fueled by pure, unadulterated spite and the maximum overdraft limits on 3 different high-interest credit cards, my new reality rapidly took shape. Aegis Polymers. Limited Liability Company was officially registered and incorporated right on my sticky kitchen table, which was currently buried under a massive mountain of crumpled legal paperwork and approximately 15 empty energy drink cans. The pathetic hobby that my former boss had openly mocked was now a fully recognized, legally binding corporate entity. I immediately signed a short-term commercial lease on a dilapidated, drafty warehouse out in the deep, forgotten industrial suburbs of the city, using every single ounce of my mechanical engineering and chemistry knowledge. I transformed that empty, freezing concrete shell into a highly functional, miniaturized chemical extraction line. I recruited 3 desperately broke, incredibly brilliant university chemistry students to work part-time, paying them strictly under the table with the very last of my borrowed funds. We hauled in tons of discarded agricultural waste, rotting corn stalks and soybean hulls, and began the brutal process of refining them into pure industrial gold. We became a squad of nocturnal ghosts operating in total secrecy. I worked at a frantic, almost psychotic pace of 20 hours a day. The deafening roar of our makeshift centrifuges became my new heartbeat. My hands were perpetually stained. My face was constantly smudged with dark organic chemical residue, and my clothes smelled permanently of fermented agricultural byproducts. I had never been more physically exhausted in my entire life, practically sleeping on the hard concrete floor when I could not keep my eyes open. Yet I had never felt more dangerously alive and focused. While my small, dedicated team and I were practically drowning in sweat and raw materials, Marcus was working his absolute magic on the corporate end of the spectrum. Utilizing his extensive, deeply entrenched network of industry contacts, he quietly and systematically pushed the name Aegis Polymers into the National Supply System's master database. He brilliantly categorized our specific bioadhesive under the highly sought-after classification of a priority green alternative material. We were practically invisible to the big corporate players, just a tiny blip on the logistical radar. Yet we were officially certified, fully compliant, and completely ready for mass commercial distribution. Late one Tuesday night, after the students had finally gone home, I stood completely alone in the freezing warehouse. I was staring at the very first industrial-sized pallet of our packaged, finalized material, which was wrapped tightly in heavy, clear industrial plastic. I ran my chemically stained fingers over the freshly printed black and silver Aegis logo slapped onto the side of the drum. A cold, hard, entirely ruthless smile stretched across my face in the dim lighting. I knew exactly what I was doing. I was not just manufacturing commercial glue in the dark. I was meticulously forging the exact silver bullets I needed, loading them directly into the chamber, and aiming them straight at the Achilles heel of the corporation that had foolishly tried to bury me. Exactly 6 months evaporated like highly volatile solvent exposed to the open air. The freezing, drafty suburban warehouse where I nearly froze to death while mixing chemicals on a concrete floor was nothing more than a distant, gritty memory. Aegis Polymers had rapidly and violently mutated from a desperate, heavily indebted startup operating on a sticky kitchen table into a legitimate, terrifyingly efficient corporate predator. We had officially leased a sprawling, state-of-the-art industrial manufacturing plant on the heavily guarded outskirts of the city. My initial team of 3 exhausted college students had aggressively expanded into a highly disciplined, well-compensated workforce of over 50 technicians operating across 3 continuous, unyielding shifts. Giant, gleaming steel silos now held our raw agricultural materials, dominating the local skyline. Massive commercial centrifuges and highly complex filtration systems hummed smoothly around the clock, producing thousands of gallons of our proprietary bioadhesive every single day. We were generating substantial, undeniable capital, but we moved with the absolute, calculated silence of a ghost ship navigating through a dense fog. Every single vendor, distributor, logistical partner, and contractor was legally bound by impenetrable, ironclad non-disclosure agreements crafted by the most vicious corporate lawyers I could hire. Absolutely no one knew my actual name. I was merely a faceless, phantom entity pulling the highly lucrative strings from behind a heavily fortified corporate curtain. Then, the universe delivered the ultimate, perfectly timed catalyst, executing a twist of fate so flawless it felt orchestrated by a divine hand. On a seemingly ordinary, overcast Tuesday morning, the Federal Environmental Protection Agency dropped an absolute regulatory nuclear bomb directly onto the heads of the industrial chemical manufacturing sector. They abruptly and permanently banned the commercial usage and importation of a specific, highly toxic synthetic binding compound, aggressively citing severe and undeniable long-term ecological damage to underground water tables. It was a sweeping, brutal federal mandate with absolutely zero room for negotiation. Corporate lobbying, or temporary grace periods. The fines for non-compliance were astronomical, designed to bankrupt any company foolish enough to defy the order. The irony of the situation was so overwhelmingly delicious, so intensely satisfying, that I actually stopped what I was doing and poured myself a generous glass of incredibly expensive champagne at exactly 10 o'clock in the morning. That newly outlawed, completely toxic compound just happened to be the absolute, irreplaceable core ingredient holding together the entire flagship product line of Vertex Biosolutions. It was the exact product line that Trent directly oversaw, the very foundation of his inflated corporate ego and the sole justification for his heavily padded, multi-million-dollar annual bonus structure. Without that specific, suddenly illegal chemical binder, Trent's entire division was effectively paralyzed, reduced to nothing more than useless machinery and rapidly expiring contracts. The resulting chaos within the sterile, glass walls of my former employer must have been absolutely biblical to witness. Vertex was suddenly bleeding massive amounts of capital by the second. They were legally forced by federal regulators to immediately halt their primary production lines, shut down their mixing vats, and urgently scramble to reformulate their entire flagship catalog before their massive international clients began pulling their accounts. But chemical engineering is a harsh, incredibly unforgiving science. You cannot simply swap one complex molecule for a completely different one and magically expect the same industrial tensile strength and thermal resistance. The procurement department at Vertex, suddenly facing the wrath of a terrified board of directors, was thrust into a blind, desperate, sweat-inducing panic. They frantically scoured the global supply chain market, pulling every string and calling every broker, desperately searching for a legally compliant, eco-friendly adhesive that could actually withstand severe, heavy-duty industrial stress without degrading. They tested dozens of alternatives, and every single one of them failed miserably, snapping under pressure or melting under high heat. There was exactly one viable solution available on the entire international market that miraculously met the new, draconian federal regulations while simultaneously maintaining the exact molecular durability Vertex required to survive. That singular perfect solution was manufactured exclusively by Aegis Polymers. Blinded by the terrifying, very real prospect of permanently halting production and hemorrhaging tens of millions of dollars in breached contract penalties, the Vertex procurement executives did not pause to conduct a deep, invasive background check on the obscure corporate entity that was suddenly offering to save their lives. They were drowning, and I was the only ship offering a life preserver, operating entirely through an automated, heavily encrypted third-party commercial brokerage system that Marcus had brilliantly set up to mask our true identity. Vertex blindly and desperately signed a massive, legally binding, long-term supply contract with my company. They authorized astronomical purchasing orders, committing to paying premium, heavily inflated emergency prices just to secure the material. They were completely and utterly unaware that they were voluntarily handing the absolute keys to their financial survival directly to the very woman they had unceremoniously, brutally thrown onto the freezing Chicago pavement just 6 short months prior. It was the ultimate, invisible heist. I had not stolen their money. I had simply waited for them to desperately beg me to take it. I sat entirely alone in my spacious, newly furnished corner executive office. The walls were not cheap, standard-issue drywall. They were thick, soundproof, floor-to-ceiling glass panes overlooking my pristine, hyperactive manufacturing floor. My massive mahogany desk was clear of clutter, save for a single cup of perfectly brewed artisan coffee. My dual widescreen monitors glowed brightly in the dim light, displaying the live, heavily encrypted incoming procurement data. I watched with a cold, highly calculated, predatory fascination as the massive, frantic orders from Vertex flooded into my proprietary logistical tracking system. Their extreme urgency was automatically flagged by the software in bright, desperate red text that flashed rhythmically on the screen. I leaned back slowly in my heavy leather ergonomic chair, steepling my fingers together as I meticulously ran the complex financial mathematics in my head. I knew their internal, highly classified production quotas intimately, because I had spent years analyzing them while working under Trent. I knew exactly how heavily Trent relied on this specific, singular supply chain to meet his quarterly deliverables. By my exact, conservative calculation, a staggering 80% of Trent's projected revenue for the upcoming financial quarter now rested entirely, irreversibly in the palm of my hand. I owned him. I could have simply logged into the portal and aggressively denied their desperate orders, but a flat, immediate refusal would have been a quick, relatively painless death for him. They would have panicked, declared force majeure, and eventually found some vastly inferior workaround after taking a severe financial hit. I did not want Trent to simply lose money. I wanted him to slowly, agonizingly suffocate under the crushing weight of his own incompetence. I wanted him to feel the exact same sheer, desperate panic, the exact same sickening lack of control that I felt when he casually ordered security guards to strip me of my livelihood. I reached forward, my hand resting lightly on my wireless mouse, and calmly accessed the master logistical control panel of our distribution network. I did not reject the massive, multi-million-dollar Vertex contracts. Instead, I carefully, quietly, and methodically reassigned their entire corporate account to the absolute lowest possible priority level in our automated fulfillment algorithm. I effectively engineered a completely legal, agonizingly slow, calculated drip feed of their vital, life-saving materials. We would send them just enough adhesive on a Monday morning to keep their massive assembly lines turning on and giving them a fleeting sense of false hope, only to force them to abruptly shut down again 3 hours later, due to critically insufficient supplies. I was slowly, methodically, and invisibly tightening a perfectly crafted noose right around Trent's neck, watching the oxygen slowly drain from his career. And the most beautiful part of it all was that he did not even realize he was already a dead man walking. The massive, roaring production lines at Vertex Biosolutions ground to an agonizing, highly publicized, and incredibly expensive metallic halt. It was not a sudden, clean crash that could be easily managed by public relations executives, but rather a slow, excruciating mechanical death by complete material starvation, while my pristine, hyper-organized facility hummed with the rhythmic, heavily synchronized soundtrack of pure industrial victory, miles away in the city center. Trent was suffocating in a terrifying, absolute silence. The silence of dead machinery is the most expensive sound in the corporate manufacturing world. Dozens of their absolute largest, most lucrative international clients, massive global corporations that absolutely did not tolerate supply chain delays, began aggressively flooding the Vertex legal department with vicious breach of contract notifications. These clients threatened massive, highly destructive lawsuits because Vertex simply could not deliver the required chemical materials on the dates they had legally promised. The internal financial damage estimates were catastrophic, quickly and violently spiraling into the tens of millions of dollars in sheer, completely unrecoverable capital losses. The giant chemical empire was bleeding out rapidly from 1,000 tiny, invisible paper cuts, and I held the only bandage in existence. I could practically visualize the exact, horrifying moment Trent completely lost his heavily manicured, highly arrogant composure. According to the terrified whispers echoing furiously through the corporate grapevine, he convened an absolutely mandatory, high-stakes emergency summit in the very same soundproof, glass-walled conference room where he had publicly executed my entire professional career just half a year prior. Only this time, the tables were completely reversed, and he was the one bleeding out on the polished mahogany floor. He paced like a rabid, cornered animal inside his incredibly expensive tailored suit, his face flushed a dangerous mottled purple that signaled pure, unadulterated panic. When the panicked head of procurement nervously explained that they were completely out of adhesive reserves and that the automated production lines were officially dead, Trent finally snapped. He grabbed a heavy ceramic coffee mug from the center table and hurled it with maximum violent force against the reinforced glass wall. It shattered into hundreds of jagged, razor-sharp pieces, scattering across the expensive carpet like a physical manifestation of his rapidly crumbling corporate empire. He screamed, his voice completely raw, high-pitched, and hysterical, loudly demanding that the procurement team find a way to violently force this mysterious, uncooperative supplier known as Aegis to release the massive stockpile of goods immediately. He aggressively threw around threats of severe legal action, corporate bullying, and physical intimidation, desperately relying on the exact same toxic, heavy-handed tactics that had successfully built his entire 20-year career. But his aggressive, loud bullying was utterly useless against an invisible ghost who held all the cards. The deeply traumatized, heavily sweating procurement team scrambled desperately back to their computer terminals, practically weeping as they frantically drafted increasingly desperate emails and authorized absolutely ridiculous, highly inflated financial offers. They blindly and aggressively threw massive amounts of money at the problem, attempting to heavily bribe Aegis with premium, heavily expedited purchasing orders that offered double, and eventually triple, the standard market rate for our proprietary bioadhesive. Every single one of their desperate financial offers was met with a cold, immediate, and fully automated rejection from my heavily encrypted logistical server. Finally, the exhausted, totally defeated lead procurement officer had to physically march back into Trent's private executive office. The man was physically trembling, his shirt soaked in nervous sweat. As he delivered the absolute fatal blow, he reported that Aegis completely and categorically refused all frantic attempts to negotiate higher pricing structures. Furthermore, our ruthless, highly paid external legal representative had formally and officially notified Vertex that their corporate entity had been permanently downgraded and restricted within our internal distribution system. We had officially classified the massive corporation of Vertex Biosolutions as a high-risk partner due to extreme operational instability and severe unreliability. It was the ultimate corporate insult, delivered with freezing, bureaucratic perfection. As Trent was busy violently imploding inside his glass cage, I was sitting comfortably and incredibly calmly in my custom ergonomic leather chair, gently swirling a glass of expensive sparkling water with a slice of fresh lemon. My personal cell phone buzzed quietly against the polished, dark wood of my massive executive desk. It was a highly encrypted, deeply confidential text message from Sarah, a brilliant senior analytical chemist and a deeply trusted former colleague who had quietly kept in close touch after my brutal, public termination. Her message was brief, completely frantic, and absolutely dripping with dark, highly satisfying corporate gossip. She explicitly revealed that the highly secretive, completely ruthless executive board of directors had officially launched a massive, invasive internal investigation into Trent. They were investigating his profound, undeniable incompetence regarding the entire supply chain management disaster that was currently destroying their quarterly profit margins. The powerful, highly greedy shareholders were aggressively demanding a sacrificial lamb to appease the furious international clients, and Trent was actively being fitted for the slaughterhouse. Sarah confirmed what I already knew deep in my bones. Trent was mere days, perhaps even only a few short hours, away from permanently losing his prestigious vice president title, his massive office, and his entire professional identity. Driven completely and utterly mad by the rapidly approaching, violent death of his heavily protected legacy, and pushed entirely to the absolute wall by the furious, unrelenting board of directors, Trent decided he had to take matters into his own trembling hands. He realized he could no longer rely on his terrified, incompetent subordinates to save his life. If he was going to somehow miraculously salvage his multi-million-dollar career, he needed to personally intimidate the hidden executives of Aegis Polymers. He desperately planned to completely bypass the automated, highly secure broker systems, physically fly out to our manufacturing headquarters, and leverage the massive, intimidating weight of the Vertex corporate name to force a favorable resolution. Late that exact same evening, entirely desperate and sweating profusely in his lavish, dimly lit executive suite, he violently hammered the keyboard of his high-end computer terminal. He forcefully bypassed the standard corporate security firewalls and dug incredibly deep into the state commercial registry databases, aggressively pulling the highly detailed, completely unredacted business registration documents for Aegis Polymers Limited Liability Company. He frantically scoured the dense, complex legal paperwork, his bloodshot eyes desperately searching for a target, a name, a human being he could bully and destroy. He finally scrolled down to the executive leadership and corporate ownership section, the thick, highly arrogant blood pumping furiously through his elevated veins, instantly turned to solid, freezing ice, the name legally registered as the sole founder, the absolute majority owner, and the chief executive officer of the very company that was currently strangling his entire existence to death, was printed in bold, undeniable, razor-sharp black ink. It read, Emery Bishop. The heavy, polished oak of my executive desk anchored me as the specialized, direct-line phone suddenly pierced the absolute quiet of my office. It was a sharp, demanding ring. I slowly shifted my gaze to the glowing digital display. The caller identification did not show a generic corporate number. It displayed the highly specific, direct internal extension originating from the vice president's suite at Vertex Biosolutions. Trent was calling me himself. I let it ring 3 times. The sound was a rhythmic, desperate pulse in the otherwise silent room. On the 4th ring, I reached out and lifted the heavy receiver. I pressed the cold plastic to my ear and allowed exactly 2 full seconds of agonizing, dead silence to stretch across the line. Let him sweat. Let him wonder if I was even there. Then, drawing upon every ounce of absolute freezing authority I now possessed, I spoke in a perfectly level, chillingly professional tone. Aegis Polymers, Emery speaking. On the other end of the line, the sound of Trent breathing was chaotic, ragged, and undeniably panicked. He sounded like a man who had just sprinted up 10 flights of stairs. When he finally spoke, his voice was a horrifying, pathetic imitation of his usual arrogant charm. He was physically humbling himself, his tone dripping with a desperate, cloying friendliness that made my skin crawl. Emery, listen to me, he practically begged, the words tumbling out of his mouth in a frantic rush. I know we had some unfortunate old misunderstandings in the past, but you have to look at the bigger picture here. You are sitting on the exact shipment we need to survive this week. I am asking you, as a professional, to put all of that aside. I can fix this. I will personally guarantee that you are brought back to Vertex immediately. I will give you the title of Director of Research and Development. Whatever salary you want, we can make it happen. Just please, release the hold on those bioadhesive barrels. I did not feel a single drop of anger. I did not feel the need to scream, or mock him, or raise my voice even a fraction of a decibel. True power does not need to shout. While he was hyperventilating over the phone, I casually reached forward and flipped a page of the logistical report resting on my desk. The crisp rustle of the thick paper echoed clearly through the receiver. I am sorry, Trent, I replied, my voice as calm and placid as a frozen, bottomless lake. But it is the strict policy of my company not to collaborate with any corporate partners who possess a documented history of severely misjudging the fundamental value of independent research and development. In our industry, we generally refer to that kind of severe miscalculation as a pathetic hobby. I did not wait for a response. I did not give him the satisfaction of uttering a single additional syllable. I simply lowered the receiver and placed it firmly back onto the base. The soft, definitive click of the plastic disconnecting the call sounded exactly like the heavy lid of a coffin being nailed completely shut on the 20-year career of the man who had tried to destroy me. The fallout was swift, brutal, and utterly irreversible. By the time the stock market opened the very next morning, shares of Vertex Biosolutions were aggressively plummeting in a terrifying freefall. Faced with catastrophic financial losses and a completely paralyzed supply chain, the highly unforgiving board of directors executed their final move. Trent was officially and permanently terminated without a shred of ceremony. There was no severance package negotiation, no polite farewell email, and absolutely no corporate dignity. He was forced to pack a tiny cardboard box and march out of the towering glass lobby under the silent, deeply pitying stares of the exact same employees he had terrorized for 2 decades. As for me, my story ends exactly where it belongs. I stood on the elevated steel walkway overlooking the massive, spotless floor of my sprawling industrial facility. I took a slow, deeply satisfying sip of incredibly expensive artisan coffee from a heavy ceramic mug. Down below, dozens of massive commercial transport trucks were lining up at the loading docks. Forklifts were smoothly loading hundreds of heavy steel drums, every single one of them proudly branded with the bold black and silver logo of Aegis Polymers, preparing to ship my groundbreaking creations to every corner of the country. I smiled, watching my empire operate in perfect harmony. It is the ultimate, undeniable truth of the corporate world. The absolute sweetest, most devastating form of revenge you can ever achieve is massive, unprecedented, and total success. Thank you so very much to every single one of you for taking the time to listen to my story today. I would absolutely love to know where you are tuning in from, so please let me know your city or country in the comments below. If you found today's journey satisfying and want to help keep this community alive, please consider supporting us by joining the Boss Revenge Stories Patreon channel. Over there, you will gain access to the absolute best, highly exclusive, true revenge stories that are simply too intense for us to make public on YouTube. You can join our private community right now by scanning the QR code currently displayed on your screen, or you can simply click the Patreon link provided down in the video description or pinned in the top comment. Thank you again, and have a wonderful day.